Hello everyone and welcome to another Task 1 modelled writing lesson. In this lesson we're going to be looking at a Task 1 question that involves bar charts. Now any Task 1 question that has charts, graphs or tables is going to need a very similar report. So the structure, the vocabulary, the language is going to be very similar. However, I think it's highly useful to you to see me model write more than one question. So you can see me go through the process again from the very beginning, seeing the question, to making a plan and then writing the report. So before we take a look at the question, let's go over the checklist one more time. This features checklist is exactly the same for any graph, chart or table question because the language is going to be the same in terms of the adverb plus verb, the adjective plus noun. We can use both those features for any graph, chart or table question. At the top four features in red, we have our features for organisation, structure and answering the question. And below in green, we have features for vocabulary and grammar. I really do recommend trying to use this features checklist when you are practicing writing a report. Let's move on to taking a look at this question. The bar charts show household expenditure across four main areas in the UK, Australia and Japan in 2013. Summarise the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Okay, so that is our question and now it's time to take a look at the visual information that we have. Imagine that I have just been shown this on my actual test day. I'm just going to spend a short amount of time having a look over this data and getting a better understanding about the visual information given to me. As always, begin with the title. Household expenditure in 3 countries in 2013. So this title is telling me exactly what the bar chart is showing me. Household expenditure in 3 countries. Now let's move along to having a better look at what we are being shown. On the y-axis we have percentages from 25% down to 0, which is the total household expenditure. Along the bottom on the x-axis we have 4 types of household expenditure: housing, healthcare, food and transportation. Underneath this we can see the 3 colour-coded countries, which is in orange the UK, in black Australia and in grey Japan. So I've got a better understanding about the big picture of what the data is showing me, but I haven't yet really looked at specific figures. So I've taken a quick look at the visual information and it's now time that we make a short plan. So I now need to think about my grouping for this question. So let's take a quick look at the bar chart again. I need 2 groups. So we've got 3 countries, so maybe not grouping by country as it's an odd number and I need 2 groups. But maybe it would make sense if we group housing and healthcare into group 1 and food and transportation into group 2. Let's go with that. Group 1, we have housing and healthcare. And in group 2, we'll go with food and transportation. Okay. So for the overview, let's have HH for housing and healthcare. and we'll say overall, we can say high spending for both HH, housing and healthcare, although not high for health in UK. That's quite long, but that's okay. It's not going into too much specific detail, which we don't want in the overview. And let's do FT, which is food and transportation. Food and transportation seems to be all under 20% of total expenditure. And I'll just show you now. So, for food and transportation in all 3 countries, there is not one country spending more than 20%. So all countries spend less than 20% of their total expenditure on both food and transportation. Now, you may think that I've gone into giving a figure or a fact for this, for the food and transportation, but it's an overall statement, and that's what the overview is. It gives us an overall idea of what is happening in the data. And then in the detail paragraphs, we can go into more specific figures. Okay, so that is my plan finished. We'll now move on to actually writing this report. So, I'm going to need to start with my paraphrased introduction. Again, let's take a look at the first part of the question. The bar charts show household expenditure across 4 main areas: housing, healthcare, food and transportation, in the UK, Australia and Japan in 2013. So, let's begin. The bar charts, the given, just change it a little bit. The given bar charts present total household expenditure, household spendings. I'm using a synonym here for expenditure across 4 common areas in 3 countries. And here I will use a semicolon to begin a list. The UK, Australia and Japan, across 3 countries. The UK, Australia, across 3 countries. And let's add the date as well, in 2013. Okay, so let's read that back and make sure it's okay. Spending. The given bar charts present total household spending across 4 common areas in 3 countries in 2013. The UK, Australia and Japan. Yeah, that sounds quite good to me. So that's my paraphrased introduction complete. Now we'll move on to our overview. In the plan, I grouped housing and healthcare into group 1 and food and transportation into group 2. And I noted that housing and healthcare were high expenditure areas, except for the UK in healthcare. And for food and transportation, I noted that all countries spent under 20%, which you can see here. So that's what I'll write for general statements in my overview. And as ever, we begin with overall. So let's begin with group 1, housing and healthcare. Overall, housing and healthcare are mainly or mostly high areas of expenditure for all 3 countries. Now, I'm not going to mention the UK here actually, I'm just going to say mostly, which indicates that not every single country is spending high, but overall most countries are spending high on housing and healthcare. So that's group 1 done for my overview, and group 2, let's take a look. So, a high expenditure for all 3 countries. On the other hand, both food and transportation, most food and transportation spending for all countries do not exceed 20% of total spending. And here you can see that I've added spending twice. I don't like repeating myself in my writing, so I need to think of another word for this. I could use expenditure as I'm in a different sentence. So let's write expenditure here. Expenditure. Okay, so let's read this back. Overall, housing and healthcare are mostly high areas of expenditure for all three countries. On the other hand, and we've got a nice opener there, both food and transportation spending for all countries do not exceed 20% of total expenditure. So there we have it. That is my overview complete. So it's time to move on to our detailed paragraphs. And group 1, we have housing and healthcare. So let's start writing for this. I'll begin by making an overall statement about housing. I can see that all three countries are spending over 20% on housing, so that's what I will start with. All three countries, the UK, Australia and Japan, spend over 20% of their total budget on housing. On housing. Let's add a hyphen just to add a bit more detail. The highest being in grey, we have Japan. And it looks like they're spending around 26%. So let's say around 26%. The highest being Japan with around 26% of spending of total outlay. I don't want to repeat myself too often. Of total outlay going towards accommodation. Again, I don't want to keep repeating myself with housing. Accommodation is perfectly fine. Okay, so that's my first part done for housing. Let's describe healthcare. And of course, check the spelling. Okay, so healthcare is quite interesting because Australia and Japan both spend quite a lot on healthcare, whereas in the UK it's definitely a lower figure, significantly lower, we might write. So we could say, on the other hand, healthcare, or how can we compare them? Healthcare is also a major area of spending for both Australia and Japan, who spend, how much is Australia spending? Let's say 22, who spend around 22%, and Japan is 20% and 20% respectively. Respectively is a great way to link figures to nouns, to names. So if I say respectively, it means 22 goes to Australia, the first figures and name given, and 20% goes to Japan, the second name or second figure given. So it links these together. Okay, and we also want to mention that the UK is spending significantly lower. However, another great opener, in the UK, this figure is significantly lower at around 7% of total money spent. Okay. So that brings us to the end of our first detailed paragraph. I've got lots of figures and detail in here. It's now time to move on to food and transportation. Okay, so let's take a quick look at food costs. So everyone seems to be spending between 10 and let's say 18%, or 10 to 18%, let's say. So let's start off with that. Food expenses for all three countries lay between is it 10? No, it's around 11. 11 to, and I think the UK spends the most at around, let's say 17. 11 to 17% of total money spent. I'm repeating myself again, so let's try and change something. Expenditure again is okay because we haven't said that recently. Expenditure. Okay, let's go into a bit more detail about the spending on food. So maybe I could describe the lowest and highest amounts. Australia is the lowest and the UK is the highest. So Australia's total outlay for food was around 11%. Whereas the highest spenders for eating, we could say, just so that we're not repeating food, the highest spenders for eating were in the UK at about 17% of total spending. Okay, just have a quick read through, and I think that's food described. Food expenses for all three countries lay between 11 to 17% of expenditure. Australia's total outlay for food was around 11%, whereas the highest spenders for eating were in the UK at about 17% of total spending. Okay, that sounds good to me. Let's take a look at transportation. Is there anything that I notice comparing these two sets of data? So I have Australia and Japan spend more on transportation than they do food, whereas the UK spends the same amount. Perfect. That's something that I can quite nicely describe here. Both Japan and Australia spend more, significantly, spend slightly more, so I've got an adverb, spend slightly more on transportation than food, whereas in the UK, the figure for spending on food and transportation remains the same at around 17%, and I've just noticed a slight spelling mistake there. Okay, so let's read this second bit back. Both Japan and Australia spend slightly more on transportation than food, whereas in the UK, the figure for spending on food and transportation remains the same at around 17%, and this is just giving a bit more detail and specific figures. Okay, so that's my second detailed paragraph complete. Let's take a read through the whole report. The given bar charts present total household spending across 4 common areas in 3 countries in 2013: the UK, Australia and Japan. Overall, housing and healthcare are mostly high areas of expenditure for all 3 countries. On the other hand, both food and transportation spending for all countries do not exceed 20% of total expenditure. All 3 countries, the UK, Australia and Japan, spend over 20% of their total budget on housing. The highest being Japan, with around 26% of total outlay going towards accommodation. There you go. Healthcare is also a major area of spending for both Australia and Japan. So this figure here. who spend around 22% and 20% respectively. However, in the UK, this figure is significantly lower at around 7% of total money spent. Food expenses for all three countries lay between 11 to 17% of expenditure. Australia's total outlay for food was around 11%, whereas the highest spenders for eating were in the UK at about 17% of total spending, which is here. Both Japan and Australia spend slightly more on transportation than food, whereas in the UK the figure for spending on food and transportation remains the same at around 17%. Now, taking a quick look over our features checklist, the one that stands out to me is the adverb, verb, vocabulary, grammar, sentence type. Now, we haven't really included much of this, and I think that's because we aren't comparing between different times, different years. But that's perfectly fine. You will find that not always you need to use certain features. That brings us to the end of this lesson. If you've got any questions, please go to the Q&A section and I will come and help you there. See you in the next lesson.